right. So thank you all for joining us for the next session in the Media and Family track of the Within Summit. As a reminder, all the conference information and sessions, including this one, are live and recorded and available in the attendee dashboard. It's my pleasure to introduce two amazing journalists as your moderator and panelist for the fireside chat about the power of expressing your lived experience as a journalist. Your moderator for this session is Fiona Lowenstein, an award-winning independent journalist, producer, speaker, and consultant. Fiona has been published in the New York Times, Teen Vogue, Vox, and is also founder of Body Politic, grassroots patient-led health justice organization. Fiona also, shameless book plug, has a book coming out called The Long COVID Survival Guide. It's available for pre-order, highly recommend. Your panelist for this session is Michelle Konstantinovsky. Michelle has covered eating disorders, body positivity, diet culture, other mental health related topics in publications such as Vogue and Glamour, Style, Oprah, many more. She's here with us today to tell a story about how her work as a journalist has impacted her recovery journey and her path to becoming an eating disorder recovery advocate. With that, I will hand it off to you, Fiona.
Thanks so much, Zach. I am so excited to be here with you, Michelle. I just feel like you have done amazing work on this beat, covering, diet culture and the anti-diet movement and eating disorder recovery. And I know that you've drawn a lot on your personal experience, which is something we have in common in kind of our approach to journalism. So I'd love to just start by asking you how you got started on this beat. When was the first time you kind of started talking about disordered eating in your reporting or even your own recovery? Did that start when you first got involved in journalism? Or was it something you always knew you wanted to do?
Yeah, I'm also so excited to be here. So thank you, Fiona, for doing this. It's funny because when we were preparing for this, I had to think about it because it feels at this point like I've been like an open book my entire life, just a TMI queen, just sharing everything at every chance I get. But yeah, it was not always like that. I think I kind of backed my way into journalism. First of all, I always was very passionate about writing, and I was an English major and a psych major, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I think when I first started writing about these topics, it was because, I'm sure we'll get into it, but I was diagnosed with anorexia when I was 16. And I think when I kind of started dabbling in writing, I would want to research the topics that were relevant to me, but without kind of claiming identity with them. So I remember one of the first freelance articles I wrote was about amenorrhea, which is when, loss of period, which is what I experienced. And there wasn't a lot of information I was getting from my doctors that was super satisfying about it as it related to the eating disorder. So I just wanted to dive deeper into it, but it was, super objective. It was basically like, a Wikipedia entry. It was in my very early writing days. And when I went to grad school at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, I knew that I wanted to write about eating disorders. But again, it was kind of from that objective part. And my first year of grad school was super challenging, just in terms of everyone was doing hardcore news. We kind of had to get, and I'm grateful for that experience, but I was not accustomed to it. It was not the kind of journalism I thought I wanted to do. And when it came time to kind of focus on our master's projects, I decided I wanted to do an eating disorder double project. And I did it on health disparities on midlife eating disorders and women of color with eating disorders. And again, it was kind of from that taking a step back. And through exploring those topics, I started writing a little bit more about my experience and talking a little bit more openly about it, because I was struggling also at that time. And it wasn't really something I could hide from my classmates or my teachers. And so I would say that's kind of when it started to be less of an open secret and more of just me being honest about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that sounds like a fascinating project on health disparities. And you mentioned that kind of part of the reason you first got into it was just wanting information that you had trouble finding, right? And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to the reactions and responses you get to your work, both in the sense of what it feels like to be so vulnerable and put yourself out there, and I know from personal experience, sometimes that means judgment from family and friends or strangers on the internet, but also in terms of like providing this vital information that maybe is missing or helping people feel represented in these stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think things have changed so much. It's weird to think now that I started writing. I graduated from college in 2006. So that's kind of when I started dabbling in freelance and while I was working full-time jobs. And so that was, however many years ago. And I think at that time it wasn't as common to speak out about your mental health. And thankfully we're at a point now where it is much more common, much more universal and not something to be ashamed of. It's not stigmatized as much. So I think in those early days, that's why I sort of tiptoed, and my family has been the most supportive family I could ever ask for. But I do think, they wanted to maintain some kind of privacy, probably to protect me more than anything. And I remember, this is like its own story, but I had sold a story on the genetics of anorexia. There's research coming out that's super interesting about, the genetic component behind it. And Cynthia Bulick is like my guardian angel of all researchers. I love her. And she was very helpful with my thesis. And she and I were working together on this project. Very long story short, I sold it 3 times. It got killed at every publication. It was 7 years before it actually came out. And that is now, it lives on Medium's health site. I'm very happy it finally came out. But the first time I sold it was to Glamour. And this was probably, 7 or 8 years ago. And I had to have a conversation with my mom, like, this is about the genetics of eating disorders. This isn't just about me. This would be talking about you. This would be talking about like food issues you've had and body issues you've had. And I was bracing myself for her to be extremely, not cool with it. And she really surprised me. And she said, this is important. People need to hear this. Go for it. And her permission, her green light really meant a lot to me. My mom and I are extremely close. And so, when she kind of no longer had that worry of what are people going to think? Are you going to be okay? It really helped put me at ease about it. So that was, even though that story was killed many times before it finally came out, in between selling it the first time and it coming to publication, I had many opportunities in between to write about my own stuff. And when I did, I mean, the reaction still surprises me. Like, I don't feel that I'm being vulnerable. I sometimes am like, this is too much. I should pull it back, but I never do. And I think that's just like, I don't know how. I am an open book by nature. And I'm sure you experience this also, of getting DMs from strangers and getting emails and tweets and people saying like, this is my story. How did you know? It's like, I didn't, it's mine. And we all share it. And that is my absolute favorite part of doing this. I mean, I will never get tired of it. It never gets old. And sometimes it's sad to hear that so many people share that same, the same suffering that you have. But I think when these things are veiled in secrecy, they are so much tougher to navigate, if not impossible. So I think finding community on all that has been incredible.
That's amazing. And I love the fact that you were able to have that honest conversation with your mother and that she was on board. And I'm guessing that seeing kind of her willingness to be vulnerable may have made it a little bit easier to kind of cross that road yourself of, oh, wow, everyone's going to know this now.
Yeah, for sure. And like, again, it was never, we didn't keep things under wraps necessarily. It was more of like an open secret, like, oh, Michelle's got stuff, but I think it was more a cultural shift in how we talk about mental health issues, eating disorders, all of it, how we talk about weight, how we talk about bodies. So I think that played a role as well. But I mean, having her kind of give her blessing on it really meant a lot to me. I never wanted to do anything, especially when it's not just about me. It's about our family. It's about her. It's about, it's about more than just my story. So it meant a lot to me to have that. And for some reason, I've been able, again, open book TMI syndrome. I just let it all go now. So for better or worse.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's great. And obviously I have similarly had that experience of kind of people connecting with your work and being like, I feel seen in this work. And it sounds like you also were really ahead of the curve. I mean, I think about 2006, like the conversations about mental health and diet and fat phobia were super different back then. And I'm guessing this is part of the reason why you might have had trouble selling that first story. I'm curious if you can speak to some of the shifts you've seen in the media landscape over the past decades.
I would love to. Yes, this has been very, very top of mind for me lately, especially, I mean, always, but I just finished an entire book proposal, if anyone knows any agents out there, because I have been extremely passionate about this subject. I feel like millennials period, but I think millennial women specifically in this conversation, we're just caught in the crossfire of all these different harmful, toxic messages coming from every direction. That is not to say that every generation hasn't experienced some level of, toxic diet culture talk and weight stigma and all of that. But something just really fascinates me about, millennials. I am a millennial, I'm an elder millennial, but when you look back, talk about 2006, I just wrote an article for Glamour that was it was sort of like a way for me to write the idea of my book in article form, just to put it out in the universe, because it's been just festering in my brain. When you look back at that time, the early 2000s, the late 90s, I mean, we were at the height of like Perez Hilton, gossip blog culture. I am not claiming I didn't take part in it. I absolutely did. I was refreshing that page 50 times a day when I was working my first job. And just how we treated women in particular. I mean, we talk about Britney Spears now, and everyone, is congratulating her and applauding her bravery and, coming out of the conservatorship. But look at how we treated her and other celebrities at that time. Horrifying. And it's like, we have such bad short-term memory. Like this, it was a long time ago, but relatively pretty recent. And the way we talked about women and bodies in particular, when I was trying to promote that Glamour article on Instagram, I was putting together just images of magazine covers from that time as like a reel. And I mean, it was not hard to find 500 examples of like, get your bikini body, lose your belly fat, best and worst beach bodies. I mean, all of it. And it was almost like sanctioned disordered behaviors. It was like, now we talk about eating disorders and there's recognized mental illness around it. And we're recognizing for the most part and acknowledging these behaviors are not quote unquote normal. And I just remember growing up as a teenager, I remember thinking, well, I can't have anorexia because I eat. And what I was eating was not sufficient for, where I was in my life and how I was growing. But I knew it as a very black and white issue of like, you either have this or you don't, and only these kind of people have it. And I think we've come so far in the way that we look at that. And even in that Glamour article, I mentioned my niece who's 12 and far wiser than I will ever be in my entire life. I just spent the day with her the other day and blows my mind. But I was kind of trying to bring this topic up with her. And, Gen Z, I think like they have their own stuff. Of course, they're very public on social media in a way that I didn't have to deal with. But I was kind of asking her about body stuff and how she feels any pressure. And she said kind of, sort of, but not really. And then she was like, I heard that Victoria's Secret just got plus size models. Can you believe it took them that long? And I was like, oh my God, like, that is not a sentence that would have come out of my mouth, because I just assumed it was me that was wrong that at that age and beyond. So I have a lot of hope for the next generation. I have a lot of hope for where our cultural dialogue is going. But yes, I think we have a lot of healing to do, millennials in particular, around the trauma we suffered from so many directions.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was very heartened by that comment from your niece in the piece. I was like, okay, this is good. At least there are different expectations around what is normal, in a fashion show or in a magazine. And I know you mentioned in that article as well, seeing for the first time a model with, a roll of stomach fat in a magazine and how that impacted you. I want to ask you a little bit about kind of the rise of wellness culture, because I feel like in some ways it's allowed people to push back against the diet industry, but in other ways it's kind of repackaged, kind of toxic diet messaging under the guise of, wellness or mindfulness or whatever it is. How do you navigate this in your own writing, and how do you think it's impacting the media landscape?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's such a tricky topic. And my career it's a very strange, I mean, I say it all the time, but like I made this up. Like I do a very interesting, strange combination of work. And a lot of the work I do fitness writing. I do wellness writing. I do not do diet writing. I have my own lines that I have to draw. If a editor comes to me and asks me to write an explainer on XYZ diet, I tell them, find someone else. Like, that's my own personal boundary with that. I am a Peloton cult member, and I've interviewed all of their instructors 500 times. And I use them as an example of a company I think is getting it right. And I say that because they hit all the check marks so far. I mean, I don't work for Peloton. I don't know their direction, but the reason I take on those interviews and I want to write about them as a company is because I think they check all the boxes in how they talk about wellness. And so I have my own kind of internal alarm system where I get tons of pitches. I'm sure you do too, just inbound into my inbox. Like, do you want to write about this company? Do you want to write about this influencer? And if I see that the subject line of the email is like how to get a bikini body with this person, no, I don't want to talk to them. If it's like vitamins, but they promise to help you lose the bloat, like there's just language that sets off alarms for me internally that I know that I don't want to be associated with it. Peloton, it's not the only company, but I think the way they talk about it, they put their money where their mouth is. Like they show up in the way that they intend to show up. They don't talk about weight in their classes. They don't talk about numbers outside of, resistance and cadence or those kind of numbers. And they're not about obsessive tracking, measuring. They kind of like walk the walk. And I've appreciated that. And I highlight them in my work because I wish more companies would do that. And I think it's hard to do. I think more companies could benefit from hiring consultants who understand how to discuss wellness in a way that's not toxic. And I think it's still evolving. When I was I've been in 2 outpatient treatment centers, and the first one, they were very anti-exercise. They were, it was not inpatient, it was outpatient. But they thought exercise was completely antithetical to recovery. And that didn't work for me. And that and a lot of other things, equaled a not so great experience for me in that program. My second program was much more realistic and flexible and understanding. And I've had to kind of, create my own reality around that, is that fitness and movement are important to me. And that is not always, accepted in recovery rhetoric. And yeah, it's been kind of an interesting thing of just kind of like having to decide what my own rules are and what my own path is. And it may not line up with exact, traditional recovery dialogue. And it may also not line up with this. But I know that I have my own internal check marks for what I need to hear to know that this is something I feel safe writing about.
And it sounds like those kind of internal boundaries are coming from both a place of, ideological boundaries of you don't want to be contributing to a media landscape that's promoting toxic diet messaging. But I'm guessing it's also coming from a personal place of, what is wise for you to take on as someone who, has been in recovery. And I'm curious if you have thoughts on kind of how you manage your own recovery and potential triggers while you are reporting on these topics. I mean, I'm even just thinking about like all those magazine covers you put together. I can't imagine that going through all of those felt amazing, given the impact on us at the time when they came out. Do you have tips for kind of how to manage, your own kind of trauma response while dealing with this stuff? I know this is something that I think a lot of journalists can relate to, even outside of just the eating disorder topic.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And honestly, I don't think I do the best job. Sometimes I think I'm still learning. There are days when I do let it, I let it in, and I'm just be completely honest, like it's not always easy to separate. For the most part, though, I would say, because I mean, people have asked me that before, like, are you sure this is a career you want to do? Are you sure these are topics you want to write about? For the most part, when I interview people who are in recovery or not in recovery, I do, there is kind of a natural, I don't know if that's like the journalist part of me stepping in, but I am able to create distance between myself and that. It may be kind of a lag effect where I feel it later and, the conversation seeps in and I think more about it. But in terms of protecting myself, I mean, I think surrounding myself with media and writers and, influencers and body positive culture to have that kind of like cushion around me, so that even if I'm researching something like, the inspiration blogs from the early 2000s or something like that. The second I'm done with it, I can turn back and open my Instagram and I have like Body Posy Panda. I think she goes by she used to go by that. She's Megan Crabb. She's one of my favorite body positive influencers. I have her. I have all these people I follow who are speaking the language I need to hear. And I think that really helps. I think turning it all off and completely just, when you're done with it. I am a big pop culture fanatic. I like to zone out with my Bravo shows. I like to just turn that part of my brain off. I think just finding, comfort in things that have nothing to do with that language. And it's really hard because even in Bravo or even in, anything you turn to that's not, necessarily body image related, there's inherently going to be a body image stuff because the media is full of that. So yeah, it's hard, but I think, creating a community around you, creating social support. My boyfriend has put up with a lot of my own, like, if I have a bad day, he hears about it, and he hears all the negative thoughts I have, but I think having people you trust who you can confide that in is super important. So yeah, I would say taking a step back when you can, surrounding yourself with media and content that actually is like in line with recovery themes is really important. And then just taking a step back and also being able to unload on people who love you and will let you do it. It's really great.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it is really important for journalists to allow themselves to take a break if and when they can, right? I think that's just not a common part of journalism culture, and it's very much the hustle and grind, but like it can be quite traumatizing to work on stories that are so close to personal experiences.
For sure.
I want to ask you a little bit about, your take on writing about topics that you have personal experience with from kind of the journalistic side, because I know that there is this sort of more traditional notion that, journalists should be personally detached from the subjects we report on to achieve some kind of, objectivity. And I think that this is changing a lot with younger generations. I think we're realizing that personal experience can actually help a journalist better understand the topic they're reporting on and report on it more sensitively. But I'm curious if you have thoughts on this and if you've kind of rubbed up against this at any point in your career.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of why that first year of grad school was so challenging for me, because I really felt like an imposter. I felt like I'm not a hardcore news reporter. I am not going to be on CNN. I never reported on these topics before. And a lot of my classmates had, and they were very used to, breaking news stories, and they were so talented at it. And I kind of felt like I don't belong here. But it was also in that grad school experience that I think was my first exposure to realizing like, I don't have to do that and I can still be a journalist. I was very, very, very lucky in grad school. I worked with Michael Pollan, who had been one of my heroes for years before I got there. I don't think I even knew he was a professor at the school when I first applied, but I worked as his assistant my second year, and he is just one of the most talented food writers. He also writes about psychedelics and mental health now. He's kind of pivoted into that, and he's just as talented of a writer, researcher, editor as he is. He's the nicest person ever. And so he was such a great mentor to me. And in addition to assisting him with his classes, I participated in a food writing class, and he really helped me with the part of my thesis on midlife eating disorders and helped me get that published in Oprah Magazine. And he was just such a great mentor. And I think reading his work and the work that he would assign us in class was really the journalists inserting themselves in stories. And that may have been kind of my first real exposure to seeing that, oh, you can do that. You can still be professional. You can still be considered a journalist in, whatever sense of the word, but you can have fun with it and you can put yourself in it and you can, be part of the narrative, and you can also be serious about it. And I don't know, it just kind of opened my eyes to the possibilities and how it wasn't, again, like, I don't know if black and white thinking is part of, being that type A perfectionist that eating disorders tend to really like. But yes, it broke me out of that black and white mentality a little bit of, this is a journalist, this isn't. I saw that there was kind of flexibility in what that label could be. I also, through him, I got to just read other writers, and Peggy Orenstein was one who was also a mentor of mine. She was a friend of his and she's written some amazing books. Cinderella Ate My Daughter, about princess culture, is one of my favorites, but she wrote a piece for the New York Times years ago called The Feel Good War on Breast Cancer. And it was her experience being diagnosed with breast cancer, but it was all about pink washing, and it was all, and I mean, I learned so much about the breast cancer awareness industry and machine that I was completely unaware of, but it was through her lens of having lived it. And she researched the hell out of it like a really good journalist, which she is. And I just think reading her and Michael and all these other people who were kind of able to, you know, very deftly put themselves in the story, but not in a way that was distracting, really inspired me and showed me what was possible. So I'm aspiring every day to be more like them.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, I think today we do see more calls for, you know, hire disabled journalists, hire trans journalists, hire journalists of color, because I think there is an understanding that there's an implicit bias in a newsroom that doesn't have people from these identities, right? The absence of those experiences is not objectivity. And when I think about, I think you mentioned earlier that, you know, growing up, you weren't actually sure if you could be considered as someone who had an eating disorder because maybe your experience didn't perfectly match up to what you had seen described. In terms of kind of the shift we're seeing, do you think that enough has happened in mainstream media to kind of demonstrate that eating disorders do not only affect, you know, thin, white, cisgender women, or do we still have a ways to go in terms of kind of explaining these healthcare disparities in some of the communities that haven't adequately been represented?
Yeah, we have a ways to go. You know, like I said earlier, I want to believe that we're on the right track and we're moving toward progress. And, you know, as my niece demonstrated, I do think there's hope for the next generation. I think they have a better understanding. I think I'm really fascinated by social media because I hate it a lot of the time. I think it's evil in so many ways, but at the same time, it exposes us to, you know, people who we would have never met otherwise, body shapes, sizes, people of different ethnicities, people of different cultures. And, you know, we're able to connect with people in a way that was just not possible pre-social media. So I do see a lot of value in that. In terms of mainstream media, I think it's going to take time. I think in terms of, I don't know, I read this book also in college called Enlightened Sexism. And I thought it was super interesting because it was about how we're kind of tricked into believing that we've reached equality, gender equality specifically, because we see women playing presidents on TV and, you know, we see women in these powerful positions. I mean, this book was written like 20 years ago, but I kind of think it still applies and applies in a lot of different ways to different areas. Because yeah, I think there's a bit of, you know, media companies just kind of trying to fill a quota or like make it look like they are more aware and woke than they are. And so you can feel like they're pandering. And I feel like there's a lot of that going on where they're like, well, here you see this person on screen. So, you know, we're there, we've done it. And it's like, no, you have to do the work outside of that. Who are you hiring in the writer's room? Who are you putting in the director's chair? Who's producing the movie? It's like you said. And I think there is still, I mean, that Victoria's Secret documentary that came out recently was, I think, very telling in that Victoria's Secret was created by a white man in Ohio. Like this was, you know, we were fed this fantasy of like, this is what women want. This is what women think are sexy. And I think it's kind of a metaphor for media in general of like, who is creating these ideals? Is it women? Is it, you know, is it people of color creating these dialogues around stories of people of color? Is it, you know, I just think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of who's getting hired. I'm sure you have more to say on this, having worked in television and on that side of the camera. I mean, I just think there's a lot of progress to make. I want to believe we're heading there. We're not there yet.
Yeah, I'm with you completely. I feel like I have definitely been a part of teams where like I almost get treated as like a diversity consultant in addition to whatever job I'm doing. And it's like, just because I'm queer and genderqueer, and I'm like, I'm still like white. Like I shouldn't be doing this job.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, totally.
I think there is people, I think a lot of times media companies don't want to accept kind of the responsibility of like how much work has to be done to really change the internal culture. Yeah. When we're thinking about that sort of media responsibility, I'm curious if you have tips, guidelines you follow yourself, or just general tips on kind of best practices for interviewing vulnerable sources or even just reporting on these topics.
Yeah. I mean, every outlet I think is different in terms of what I've had editors ask me for more details around things that I'm not comfortable providing. So for example, a person's weight, number of calories a person ate at their, most sick. I want to say never, I don't know what the future holds, but my own moral compass tells me that's not right to share that information. And that's because when I was growing up reading magazines, and I would read, and this actually came up when I was writing the Glamour article recently, someone said this, they said that they read, that Best and Worst Beach Bodies or whatever, the weight of, the actresses, like the general weight of models and actresses. And they were like, well, I'm 15 and I already weigh more than that. So what does that say about me? And I just think numbers are awful. Numbers are just awful. BMI is awful. I think these are measures that no one should be measuring themselves against. So my own internal compass would be to just not go there. And I've had to push back on editors. I don't want to say I've never done it, because I'm sure at some point, maybe, back in my earlier days, maybe I didn't know that I had the opportunity to push back as a younger writer. Now I would take a very firm stance on it. And I think, I get PR pitches, like I said earlier, and usually I'll trash them if I think they could be triggering. But I've gotten a couple where I'll get, and my sister's in PR, so I feel like I can speak on this, and I have all the respect for PR people. A lot of my friends are in PR, but I think there's education that needs to be done on that side as well, because I'll get pitches with, super triggering subject lines of like, hey, Michelle, you should write about whatever. I mean, again, like I keep coming back to this, but the beach body thing, flat abs in 3 days. It's just like all the generic diet culture phrases and terms we've all seen a million times getting regurgitated in subject lines, and then they're feeding that to journalists hoping that they'll write about it. And a couple of times I've written back and been like, hi, I'm not going to write about this, and also you should really consider doing some research on eating disorders and body image, and like change your subject line, and also hire me as a consultant and pay me money. I'll come train your team not to do that. So yeah, I think just becoming aware and becoming tuned into, and I think this is again why it's so important to surround yourself with content creators who know what they're doing and who are experienced in body image topics, and just to become aware of language that is not appropriate or acceptable anymore, and is outdated and harmful and toxic, and to not use it and to not repeat it in stories, and to not write clickbait, please, ever. I don't know about you. I don't always get to write my own headlines, and that is always a fear factor for me when I submit my article, because I don't know what they're going to do with the headline. And there have been a couple times where I've had to just be like, I know you have to do what's right for the outlet, but please don't do this, or don't use this word, or don't put a weight in here, please. And my editors have been incredibly accommodating around that. But yeah, that's pretty much my stance on it.
Yeah, I think these are all really, really helpful insights. And I especially relate to what you say about, not knowing earlier in your career that you could fight for some of this stuff in edits. And listen, it's not always something that we can fight for, right? In a best case scenario, we have an editor who understands, and, we're in a position where they want to publish our work. But I'm curious if you have tips for other journalists who might want to kind of follow a similar career path, either in terms of reporting on this topic or just writing about, health and wellness experiences that are personal to them. In terms of finding editors who will be receptive, knowing what you can push back on, but also kind of, just general tips on building out your own beat.
Yeah, I mean, again, things have changed so much that even from, I graduated grad school in 2013. And at that time, like, so much of what we learned, even in terms of pitching, is now so obsolete. And it's like, I'm so grateful for everything I learned. But even at that time, it was like, send your pitch on a printed paper and mail it. Like, no, we don't do that anymore. So things have shifted rapidly and drastically and dramatically. But I think one tip I would suggest is to read a ton of content, and not necessarily to align your loyalties with an outlet, but with an editor or a writer's name. Talking about that in the Glamour article, I mentioned in the beginning of that story that Glamour was the first place I saw a model with a stomach roll, Lizzie Miller, who is phenomenal, was the model who I reconnected with for that story. But when I was reading Glamour in those days and I looked at it as kind of a trailblazing publication for body inclusivity and body positivity, Sunny Siegold was the health editor. And I mean, she has a name that just kind of stuck with me. She has such a cool name, but we've remained connected. I've written for her a couple of times. She's mostly, I think, out of the journalism game, but I've written some copy for her at other places. And she shared that Glamour article on her LinkedIn and with her network. And it was like a weird full circle moment of like, I had really aligned myself with what I saw she was doing at that time. And I kind of followed her career. Cindy Levy was the editor of Glamour at that time. I'm still hoping to work with her one day, but there have been a lot of examples of editors who if you read something that you think is like, oh, I want to do something like this, just make note of that person, follow them, see what publications they're writing for, and just consume their content. They may sometimes be freelancers like me that wield no power and can't assign you anything, but in a lot of cases, you'll find editors that way. And I think just doing your research, and if something resonates with you, if you feel compelled to follow someone, Taffy, I'm blanking on her last name, but Taffy Ackner.
Professor Ackner?
Yes. So I met her randomly in a yoga class in LA once, and it was the most bizarre thing because I had read, she wrote a story. She doesn't typically write about body image, I think, but she had written a piece about like, it was literally titled like, I was the fattest person in my yoga class or something like that. It was like a very arresting headline, and I had read it and it was so good and so compelling. And I was in LA and she just made some kind of offhand comment to me, and we started talking, and I was like, you are the person that wrote that article. And since then, I mean, I obsessively consumed her content. I read her book that is now being developed into a Netflix series. All of that to say is you don't know where these connections will come from, but if you find content that resonates with you, take note of the person that did it and just look for more stuff like that. And I think finding who is on the masthead at publications that publish stuff like that, and then just following them, following the work they do. People move around a lot also, which is why I say don't necessarily like box yourself into one outlet. But yeah, just start consuming as much of that stuff as you can to get inspiration, one, but also to make connections. And don't be afraid to reach out. My God, like the only reason I've ever had anything published is because I've been so annoying about following up and, hey, just making sure you got the email, just making sure my pitch didn't go to spam. You'd be shocked how many assignments came out of being annoying like that. So please follow up. Yeah.
Such good advice. And yeah, I absolutely think that if you find an editor, especially if you're someone writing about something that is related to your own lived experience, if you find an editor who is into what you're doing, follow them wherever they go.
Follow them. And you know,
it's really shifting, right? So
yeah. And I think it's kind of like a two-way street too, because I think editors like that are grateful to find writers who are also aligned with those values and morals, because there's so many people out there who, you know, content is a weird game, and at some point AI will take over, and that terrifies me. But these things are, when you can find someone who can speak to a subject with heart and soul, and I think lived experience in terms of topics like this, I think editors are attracted to that and want to keep that person in their circle. So I think just reaching out and making connections and write. I mean, that's like the stupidest advice ever, but if you can't publish your first clip, you need something to send around. So just start writing, start a blog. You know, it's like, I can't believe I'm giving that advice in 2022, but there are ways to get your writing out on the screen, on paper, just so you have an example of what you're capable of doing, and then you can send it off into the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have just a couple of minutes, and I feel like I have to ask you the question that I want the answer to, which is, we've talked a lot about kind of that toxic early 2000s culture. And I know that you cover pop culture. We all know that the Y2K fashions are coming back. Are we going to be able to have this kind of cultural shift, fashion shift back to low-waisted jeans and, you know, all of the terrifying styles that I think scarred many of us back in the day, without buying into the same harmful body image myths? And are you seeing different representations of these styles today than you did in, let's say, 2002, 2003?
Yes and yes. So yes, those things are coming back. It is terrifying. Look, I'm not going to call out the Kardashians. I'm not going to, but I already have in Glamour. My article previous to this was, they asked me to write about the Met Gala, and that's a whole other topic. Kim Kardashian very proudly announced the extreme measures she took to fit into Marilyn Monroe's dress. I think it's very dangerous, very tricky. Yes, a lot of the comments I got on that article, well, women can do whatever they want with their bodies, 100%. It's when you have a public platform and your following and your audience is primarily young people, I think you do have a responsibility to, preach responsible content and to not say that you starved yourself for however many weeks to fit into a piece of clothing. On the positive side, I do think, even though those fashions are coming back, I do think that there is a wider range of, manufacturers, fashion designers, creating sizes that are inclusive, creating styles that are inclusive. And I think there's less hesitancy and resistance from, again, Gen Z, who are like going to save the world. I don't think that they have the same inherent thin worship that we were raised to have in the earlier generations. So I think they're like, yeah, we can rock those styles. And they don't think the same way that we did, like, I have to fit into it. It's more that I have to find something that I feel comfortable in. So the styles and trends may be coming back. My hope is that they will be coming back in a variety of sizes and styles and cuts and ways that make everyone feel comfortable wearing them. I will not be wearing low-waisted jeans. I will tell you that right now. But if my niece wants to and she feels comfortable, she can do it. So
Agreed. Yeah, I've already seen some fashion influencers kind of showing off these styles in new ways, and it makes me feel good, because that's the idea. When a trend comes back, we have to make it new, and maybe the way we're making it new this time is to showcase more different types of bodies wearing it. So I'm with you on that. So I think we're out of time. I feel like we could just keep chatting for days. This has been so great, Michelle. I think I speak for us all when I say that your work has just done amazing things for helping people feel seen, for shifting things in the industry. And I'm really grateful that we got to have this conversation.
Well, same to you and me too. And this was such an honor. And yeah, I can't thank you enough. You've been so fun to talk to. We'll take it offline. We'll keep talking.
Well.
All right. Well, thank you both. Really appreciate it, Fiona. Thank you for such insightful questions, and Michelle for such candid answers. It was really great to hear you both. So thanks for being here and joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone.